Hi, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're here tonight to present to you about company losses due to employee fraud. So without further ado, we'll jump right into it. So first, what is employee fraud? We looked at the article, Are Your Employees Committing Fraud? From CFO.com. And that article showed us that 3 to 5% of an average company's revenue each year is lost to employee fraud. To get a better idea of what employee fraud is, there was 3 major types we found. The first type, asset misappropriation, the most common type. An example of this would be a simple theft of inventory, but it can be anything employees steal from you. It can be theft of cash, it can be theft of even opportunities for business. The next type we have here is corruption, and corruption takes the form of bribery or kickbacks. Something you might see in a company would be employees taking bribes to deal business with certain vendors. The final type is financial statement fraud. This type, it's not as common, however, it is the most costly in the form of dollars. An example of this would be like manipulating financial statements to better the company position, maybe to increase their bonus. Not only is this the most costly in terms of dollars, but it can also lead to many, many regulatory penalties and other consequences with the government. Much of the data we found came from the second article here, the Report to the Nations on Occupational Fraud and Abuse, taking data from 2016. And this article collected its data from the ACFE, which is the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. And like I said earlier, asset misappropriation, the most common type of fraud, however, financial statement fraud, the highest cost. So compliance with regulations is not enough. There's been a lot of recent regulations, Sarbanes-Oxley, etc., that aim to cut down on fraudulent activities. However, just following those regulations may not be enough to prevent all the employee fraud that can happen in a company. And later we'll mention specific controls we can implement to curb that. So I mentioned earlier in the first slide that employee fraud makes up, on average, from 3 to 5% of a company's revenue. However, preventing that fraud involves implementing controls, and those controls do have a cost. So a common question would be, is stopping the employee fraud worth it? Is it worth that cost to only gain 3 to 5% of revenue? But if we look at the numbers here, we see, say a company does $10 million in sales, 3 to 5%, that's $300,000 to $500,000. And that's money that can be directly added to the bottom line. There are costs, definitely, to implement controls to prevent that. However, you'll see immediate benefits, and those benefits, they'll only grow over time.
So, one of the cases that we found that just specifically shows the financial statement fraud was Mid-Continental Paper Converts Incorporated versus Brady, Ware, and Schulhainer, which is the auditors. And the chief financial officer, Joseph Gleason, falsified the inventory and accounting payables records. And he did this so that they could get better financing for the company, with the best intents for the company, so the company could continue to do their operations. Now, he expected that the auditors would be the ones to find the fraud and would be the ones liable if they did not. As the CFO committed the fraud for the benefit of the company, to help attain the financials to keep the company in business, he was an agent of the company. And a court found that Mid-Continental is the principal in the agency relationship, and they are ultimately liable, even though they were unaware of the situation and the fraud that was committed by their CFO. And the company had to carry the cost of the fraud, and the auditor was considered the victim in this case. And in agency law, which is the restatement of the law in the third agency from 2016, we've got the code references for specifically where it's stated. In 3.05, the CFO's position or authorities sufficiently enabled him to act on the behalf of the defendant, corporation, and thus his fraud should be attributed as a defendant. And in 1.01 and 2.03, the employee is an agent of the company because he's acting in the best interest of the company and on their behalf and in his employment capacity. And in 7.03 to 8, when the employee committed fraud with the intent of serving the good of the company is liable, as the company is a principal, even if they don't know, with or without their knowledge of it. So, principal, yep. So when is the employee liable and not the company? Well, again, same case law, agency law. The employee acts for his own benefit, and not the company. When he acts adversely to the company or specifically breaches the agency covenant in law. And the employee fraud affects the corporation. The actions of employees and agents of a corporation are attributable to the corporation when the actions are done within the scope of employment. And here's another case that referenced that situation. And here's a graph that just goes along with the report of the nations, comes specifically from that, showing the percentage of cases done by employees lower level in the company, but the costs associated with that. And then as you go higher, the percentage is smaller, but the costs are much more significant to the company. And the time frame within which this happens is employee fraud is found usually within a year, owner executive within 2, and manager falls somewhere in between. And so you can just see the longer it goes on, the higher the costs and the more liable the company is, especially as you get into owners and executives perpetrating it.
So the Merrimack College versus KPMG case is a good example of employees committing fraud. So this case deals with the Director of Financial Aid, Christine Mordock. She approved fraudulent Perkins loans and then replaced grants and other scholarships with the fake Perkins loans to balance. This enabled the college to receive more federal grants, and in this case, she was acting on the college's behalf for their benefit instead of her own benefit. Like noted here, she acted as an agent of Merrimack College. Merrimack tried to recover their losses from KPMG, their auditor, and KPMG moved for summary judgment to dismiss these charges.
So as we can see, this is a situation that no company wants to be in, yet companies still find themselves in this situation. So it's important to understand what will and what won't hold up in the court of law. In this scenario here, Merrimack College made 3 main arguments in court. The first being that the employee who committed the fraud was a low-level employee. First of all, she was the director of financial aid, so that is not at all a low-level employee. But what agency law tells us is that it does not necessarily matter what level the employee is, but rather that if the employee acts within the scope of the daily employment that he or she is involved in, then the company is still liable. So that first argument did not hold up. Their second argument was that in the end the college was actually hurt and not helped by this case, which their argument was that the whole economic benefits now versus in the future, but agency law does not really care about the economic performance, but rather that the whole motivation, or at least part of the motivation of the employee, was to benefit the agency, in which case is Merrimack College. And that was the case here. The whole reason that Christine Mordock committed the fraud was to benefit the college so that they could get more federal grants and federal money. And Merrimack's third argument was that that Christine Mordock actually acted to save her own job and not benefit the college, which, as I just said, that was not the case. But also, agency law tells us that as long as it's still within the scope of her employment, then the employer is thus liable. So the liability here was still imputed to Merrimack College.
The other side of this case was KPMG. They were found not liable. KPMG moved for summary judgment on the grounds that Merrimac's claims are barred under the equitable doctrine known as in pari delicto. And in pari delicto comes into play when two parties are at fault, but it favors the party that is less at fault and would actually allow them to recover. So in this case, the court found that Mordaugh's fraud on behalf of Merrimack was, or outweighed KPMG's negligence. So under these circumstances, Merrimack, like EJ said, was responsible for Mordaugh's actions. The deliberate misconduct was far more serious than KPMG's negligence. So in the end, the court agreed with KPMG and awarded summary judgment in this case.
So the amount of damage that can be caused by fraud is enormous. You can go to the next slide, please. So fraud you can't insure. So not only is the damage done by the employee who commits the fraud, but it's also litigation fees and any loss of business. My apologies, I'm nervous up there all of a sudden. So really the key is prevention and early detection. So on the screen right now, you will see a number of ways that I would suggest to avoid fraud in the first place. The first is separation of duties. In the case of Merrimack College, Mrs. Mordaugh should not have had sole authority to do this. Somebody should have been overlooking her work and had to have some type of oversight there. She, as an individual, just had too much power. There should be some type of ethics training and anti-fraud training. It's essentially make it clear to the employees what is fraud, what is ethical. Because especially in a lot of cases where an agent will commit fraud for the company, they are trying to do what is best for the company without realizing that it's actually going to be harmful. So make it clear that won't be tolerated. You should also include internal auditors within the organization. These auditors should be independent, should do reviews regularly, and almost as important as independence, the employee should know about it. The employee should know that there is somebody who's going to be overlooking them, will be looking over the shoulders, and act as a prevention. You should also remove incentives. So one of these is in the form of pressures. If the organization has high demands over returns, such as in the Murdoch case, that some of the employees might be forced to commit some fraud to help them out. Or rewards. If a senior manager is going to be paid to do with the stock price, an internal fraud that's going to bump up the stock price is going to be a natural incentive for them to do so. And probably most importantly and most efficiently is the tip line. Most frauds, according to the ACFE, are actually first detected by an internal tip. So in the case of Merrimack College, for instance, there's a good chance that somebody in her office was aware that something wasn't adding up. But to speak out, not only go against directly the person's boss, but what they felt like hooked the school. If there was an anonymous tip line, somebody would have come to their attention earlier. So as I was mentioning earlier, fraud is very much 3 to 5% of the business as is measurable. There's a lot of parts of it you can't measure. Loss of confidence, loss of business, litigation fees. And injury prevention is both a minor correction. So I'd like to thank you all for coming to our presentation today. I hope it was informative, and I hope you learned enough to prevent these huge consequences from happening